There are people who learned, far too early, to shrink themselves to fit into the spaces of others. People who breathe quietly so no one hears the tremble, who smile even when something hurts, who ask for little, almost nothing, because they believe any need they have is already too much. They move through life as if walking on glass, silently, calculating each step to ensure no one feels burdened by their existence. The fear of being a weight doesn't come from a single moment. It accumulates in glances, in pauses, in small dismissals that seemed trivial to those who caused them, yet grew into internal earthquakes for the ones who received them. This documentary dives into the psychology of these people, gentle souls who carry the world on their backs, yet fear taking up space within it. There is a moment, often forgotten by memory but not by the body, when a person first learns that their presence can cause discomfort. It rarely looks dramatic. Sometimes it is simply a sigh from a tired parent, a distracted "not now," or the quiet tightening of someone's shoulders when a child asks a question. Little signals that seem meaningless to the world, yet reshape an entire inner landscape. For the ones who grow up fearing they might burden others, silence becomes a shelter long before it becomes a cage. At first, the silence is protective, a shield made of observation. If I stay quiet, no one gets upset. If I don't ask, no one gets tired. If I disappear a little, everything stays peaceful. Children are experts in reading the emotional climate around them, even when no one notices they are watching. A change in tone, a withdrawn gaze, a disrupted routine, these details become lessons. Not spoken out loud, but absorbed deeply. Some children learn that love is conditional, not because someone tells them so, but because affection seems to depend on how little trouble they cause, and so they become careful. They become the ones who tiptoe around moods, who apologize before speaking, who calculate how much of themselves is acceptable before offering it. The roots of the fear take hold quietly. A child brings a concern to an adult, but the adult is overwhelmed. Not now. I'm busy. The child feels the tension, misunderstanding it as personal failure. Another day, they express excitement, but someone responds with irritation. The message becomes internalized. My feelings create problems. My needs take up too much space. These early imprints settle into the nervous system like invisible ink. You can't see them, but they shape everything. As years pass, the child becomes someone who studies the world before entering it. They scan rooms for signs of approval. They interpret expressions as warnings. They anticipate rejection long before it appears. Not because they want to, but because their survival once depended on making themselves small. Silence evolves into a habit, then into a personality trait, and eventually into a belief. I must not weigh on anyone. I must not be too much. I must exist lightly, quietly, safely. And this belief becomes the lens through which they observe life. They listen more than they speak. They offer more than they receive. They wait for permission to take up emotional space, permission that never truly comes. To them, asking for help feels like knocking on a fragile door that might break. Expressing pain feels like placing stones on someone else's shoulders. So they stay quiet, not because they don't feel, but because feeling becomes something done internally, silently, invisibly. In adulthood, this pattern blends seamlessly into relationships. They become the dependable ones, the listeners, the soft place for others. But inside, they remain the child who once learned that their weight, emotional or otherwise, could tip the balance of the world around them. The roots of silence are never loud. They don't announce themselves. They grow in the spaces where emotional needs were met with exhaustion, where vulnerability met impatience, where presence felt like intrusion. And so, without realizing it, these people build their lives around the idea that the safest version of themselves is the smallest one. Yet, the silence does not erase the longing. It only hides it. For beneath the fear of being a burden lies something profoundly human, the desire to be held without hesitation, to be accepted without calculation, to be loved without feeling like a weight. Fear rarely begins with a loud moment. Sometimes begins nev missing comfort, an unspoken reassurance, a silence where safe should have lived. People who grow up afraid of being a burden often come from environments where emotional weight was uneven, unpredictable, or quietly overwhelming, not always cruel, not always dramatic, but inconsistent enough for a child to learn that they must manage themselves carefully. The origin of this fear is almost always invisible from the outside. Some children grow up with parents who love them deeply, but who are exhausted by life. A parent who works too much. A parent who struggles with their own wounds. A parent who carries stress like a second skin. The child sees the tension, the fatigue, the heaviness, and learns to stay small to avoid adding more. Others grow up in homes where emotional expression is unpredictable. Sometimes affection comes warmly, freely. Other times, the same expression is met with irritation or distance. The inconsistency becomes a pattern. If I cause discomfort once, maybe I will cause it again. Better to stay quiet. Some families speak love through sacrifice. We give everything we have. But the child internalizes the unwritten rule beneath it. If I ask for more, I will stretch the family to thin. So they learn to stretch themselves instead. For many, the fear originates from relational imbalance. A child becomes the emotional caretaker long before they understand what that role means. Maybe a sibling needs constant attention. Maybe a parent struggles emotionally, and the child becomes the quiet anchor that keeps the household stable. Maybe the family praises independence too early, celebrating the child who never complains, never noticing the cost of that praise. And then there are the quieter wounds. The moments when a child is told they are too sensitive, the times when they share a feeling and someone laughs it off, the times when they express confusion and someone responds with impatience. These small rejections accumulate like dust, barely visible individually, but suffocating over time. Psychologically, the child adapts in the only way they can. They reduce their emotional footprint. They try to become easy, predictable, low maintenance. Attachment theory tells us that children learn who they are by how others respond to their needs. If the response is warm, they grow with confidence. If the response is inconsistent, they grow apprehensive. If the response is absent, they grow with self-blame. A child rarely thinks, "My parent is overwhelmed." Instead, they think, "I caused something. I made things harder." Even when the environment wasn't abusive, just emotionally stretched, the message still settles: you must not add weight to others. This internal script becomes a core belief, something woven so deeply into the psyche that it follows them into adulthood. In school, they hesitate to raise their hand, not wanting to take time. With friends, they avoid sharing their struggles, afraid they will ruin the mood. As partners, they apologize for being tired, sick, hurt, as if these human experiences were inconveniences. And in daily life, they often navigate relationships with quiet calculation. How much of me is safe to reveal? How much before someone feels burdened? The origin of this fear is almost always relational. Humans learn themselves through others, and when the earliest reflections suggest that their needs are too much, they learn to carry those needs alone. The tragedy is that many of these individuals were never meant to carry such a belief. Their families did not intend harm. Their parents did not want to teach fear. Life simply shaped a dynamic where the child learned to become invisible to protect everyone else. But the psyche does not forget what it learned in order to survive. And so, even as adults, strong, capable, compassionate adults, they still carry the quiet fear that their existence creates weight, not because anyone tells them this now, but because long ago, in subtle and forgotten ways, the world taught them to believe it. The human mind is built to interpret signals, emotional, social, physical. But for people who fear being a burden, the interpretation system becomes finely tuned to threat. Not physical threat, but relational danger, the possibility of disappointing someone, irritating someone, or becoming too much. Their nervous system learns to respond to these possibilities as if they were real emergencies. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, a constant scanning of the emotional environment, not consciously, not deliberately, but automatically or reflex. A shift in someone's tone, a pause in a conversation, a sigh that wasn't meant for them. Their mind catches it instantly and magnifies it into meaning. Where others see randomness, they see signs. Where others see coincidence, they see warning. It isn't that they want to assume the worst. It's that their brain, shaped by early experiences, learned that safety comes from noticing discomfort before it becomes visible. They became experts at anticipating emotional changes because, once upon a time, anticipation protected them. This heightened sensitivity creates an internal world where every reaction feels like a reflection of their worth. If someone responds slowly, they interpret it as annoyance. If someone seems distant, they assume they caused it. If someone is quiet, they fear it's because of something they said. It is not self-centeredness. It is survival logic that never got updated. The mind shrinks itself to stay safe. Neuroscience explains that the brain keeps old patterns unless something interrupts them. If a child learned that expressing needs led to tension, the brain wires itself around avoidance. Avoid speaking up. Avoid asking for help. Avoid taking emotional space. Every avoided need becomes another confirmation of the core belief: my presence must be small. My emotions must be controlled. My needs must stay hidden. And so, adulthood becomes a landscape of self-censorship. They rehearse messages before sending them. They delete texts that might sound demanding. They apologize for asking simple questions. They soften their voice, their tone, their desires, editing themselves before the world even has a chance to respond. Internally, this creates a split. The rational part knows they are not a burden. The emotional part still fears the consequences of being seen. This internal contradiction generates tension. A quiet conflict between the self they want to be and the self they learned to be. Psychologically, this shows up in several ways. 1. Sensitivity to rejection. Even minor cues feel amplified. A short reply becomes a loss. A neutral silence becomes a personal failure. 2. Emotional suppression. They feel deeply but express little. The emotion stays inside, swirling quietly, unseen, unshared. 3. Overcompensation. They give too much. Overhelp, overlisten, overextend, hoping that if they contribute enough, their existence becomes justified. 4. Self-protection through invisibility. If they are small, careful, quiet, they believe no one will ever have to carry them. In relationships, this creates a painful paradox. They crave closeness, but fear becoming a responsibility. They long to be understood, but hide the parts of themselves that most need understanding. They want to be held, but apologize for the weight of their own sadness. And because of this, others often misinterpret them as self-contained, independent, or easygoing, never realizing the effort it takes to maintain that illusion. Deep inside, the mind continues shrinking to preserve harmony. They think before feeling, they filter before speaking, they calculate before asking. Every move becomes a negotiation with their own fear. Yet the truth is simple. Their mind is not fragile, it is adaptive. It learned to protect them. It learned to anticipate, to soften, to shrink, because shrinking once kept them emotionally safe. The tragedy is that the world around them no longer requires this kind of shrinking, but the mind hasn't been told that yet. Patterns that once served as armor now feel like chains. But even chains have a history, and understanding that history is the first step toward loosening their hold. There is a quiet war inside people who fear being a burden. A subtle, invisible battle between two forces that should have never been enemies, the natural human need for connection, and the heavy guilt that comes with wanting anything at all. On one side, the need is simple: to be heard, to rest in someone's presence, to admit exhaustion without feeling weak, to ask for comfort without rehearsing the request 3 times in their mind. But on the other side, guilt rises like a tide. It whispers that needing is selfish, that asking is intrusive, that leaning on someone, even lightly, is the first step toward disappointing them. This conflict is not loud. It does not erupt in anger. It unfolds internally, quietly, often unnoticed by the people around them. When they feel sadness, they hide it. When they feel fear, they swallow it. When they long for reassurance, they pretend they are fine, because somewhere along the way, they learned that their emotions are weight, something others must carry, something that drains the room, something that takes energy they believe they are not worthy of receiving. The result is emotional self-denial. They begin to deprive themselves of what every human being needs: closeness, understanding, softness. Psychologically, this shows up as internal dissonance. They want connection, but avoid vulnerability. They crave safety but deny themselves support. They long to rest but force themselves to stay strong. They feel lonely but tell no one. It is a paradox that hurts both directions. When they try to express a need, their mind immediately interrupts. Don't say that. Don't inconvenience them. Don't make anyone worry. Even asking for a small favor can feel like crossing a delicate line, as if any request is a test of whether they are worth the effort. And so, even in deep relationships, they hesitate. They wait for the right moment. They soften their words. They apologize before speaking. They promise they won't take long. They shrink their needs until they almost disappear, hoping that invisibility will protect the relationship they cherish. But suppressing needs has a cost. Inside, resentment grows quietly, not toward others, but toward themselves. They begin to feel defective for wanting anything. They begin to feel weak for needing help. They begin to feel guilty for experiencing emotions that are deeply human. This guilt becomes a constant companion. It appears when they ask for reassurance. It appears when they show vulnerability. It appears when someone has to change plans for them. It appears when they are sick, tired, overwhelmed, moments when they need support the most. It is as if their internal compass is set to a single direction. Don't cause trouble. Don't add weight. Don't take space. This internal rigidity makes relationships feel uneven. They give endlessly. They listen deeply. They anticipate others' needs with intuitive sensitivity. But when it comes to receiving, they freeze. If someone offers help, they minimize. If someone asks what's wrong, they deflect. If someone tries to get close, they pull back just enough to hide their vulnerability. Not because they don't trust the other person, but because they don't trust their right to need. Their greatest fear is that if someone truly saw the depth of their emotions, that person would step back, overwhelmed. So they carry the emotional weight alone, believing it protects everyone else. And yet, beneath the conflict, there is a truth they rarely acknowledge. The need for connection is not a flaw. It is a sign of aliveness. It is the quiet pulse of humanity. But the guilt is persistent. It keeps them cautious, controlled, restrained. It tells them they must earn every bit of kindness they receive. It turns vulnerability into danger and desire into debt. In this chapter of their inner life, they stand between two truths, the part of them that longs to rest in someone's arms, and the part that whispers they don't deserve to be held. This conflict does not break them, but it shapes them. It teaches them to survive through emotional discipline. It teaches them to be strong where they should be soft. It teaches them to give what they cannot allow themselves to receive. And in this tension, their heart lives half open, half hidden, waiting for a moment when needing will no longer feel like guilt. There comes a moment in certain lives when silence can no longer protect. A moment when the pain that was once manageable, tucked neatly behind careful smiles and softened words, begins to spill into the open. Not because the person suddenly becomes louder, but because the weight inside them finally becomes impossible to hide. This moment rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it is a quiet evening when exhaustion settles too deeply. Sometimes it is the simple realization that they cannot keep pretending everything is fine. Sometimes it is a tender question from someone who sees through their mask. Are you really okay? And, for the first time in years, the answer feels too heavy to swallow back. This is the point where pain meets its own reflection. The moment they recognize that the silence meant to protect others has been harming them instead. The turning point doesn't come from strength. It comes from honesty, the kind that rises from within, unplanned, unforced. The kind that reveals a truth they've avoided their whole lives. Hiding is also a burden. Even silence has weight. Psychologically, this moment of recognition often appears in the form of emotional collapse. Not a dramatic breakdown, but a quiet unraveling. The mind, tired from years of hypervigilance, stops filtering feelings. The body, tired of holding tension, begins to shake. The heart, tired of shrinking, begins to swell painfully with everything it once suppressed. For some, the turning point comes through relationships. A partner who notices the distance. A friend who asks why they never reach out. A moment when someone shows genuine worry, and instead of feeling like a burden, they feel something else, surprise. Surprise that someone noticed. Surprise that someone cares. Surprise that the world did not collapse when they momentarily took up space. For others, the turning point comes through isolation. They realize they have crafted a life where they comfort everyone but themselves. Where their support is constant, but their own needs remain untouched, unspoken. Where loneliness feels familiar, almost safe, because it demands nothing from anyone else, but even loneliness has a limit. Eventually, their own reflection becomes unavoidable. They catch themselves staring at their tired eyes in a mirror, noticing how much they've aged from carrying what they never shared. In that moment, something inside them whispers, "Cannot keep living like this." This whisper is the fragile beginning of transformation. It is the first time they question the belief they have lived with for so long, the belief that their existence is weight, the belief that their needs are problems, the belief that vulnerability is dangerous. This questioning is subtle, but powerful. They begin to ask, what if my needs matter too? What if asking for help doesn't destroy others? What if I have been harder on myself than anyone else ever was? The turning point does not erase the fear, but it creates space, a small, trembling gap, where courage can enter. In this stage, their perception begins to shift. Moments they once dismissed suddenly feel meaningful. A friend offering help, a partner making space, a colleague noticing their struggle. Where they once saw burden, they now see connection. They realize that human relationships are not meant to be one-sided performances of strength. They are meant to be reciprocal, woven with the gentle exchange of care. The pain they once hid becomes a mirror reflecting back the truth. They have been carrying themselves alone for too long, and in the reflection, they begin to see the possibility of another life, one where softness is not shameful, one where vulnerability is not dangerous, one where presence is not a weight but a gift. The turning point is not the end of their fear, but it is the first moment the fear loses its authority. It is the moment they realize that the world does not collapse when they allow themselves to be seen. For the first time, they sense something like hope, quiet, unfamiliar, but unmistakably real. Healing does not arrive like a sudden sunrise. It comes quietly, almost shyly, in moments small enough to be missed if the heart isn't paying attention. For people who have spent a lifetime shrinking themselves, healing often begins with a single, fragile realization: I do not have to disappear to be loved. This realization is not loud. It does not erase years of conditioning, but it opens a doorway, narrow, trembling, but real, into a different way of existing. Reconstruction begins with permission. Not permission from others, but from within, the permission to feel, to need, to rest. At first, it feels unnatural. Asking for help feels like speaking a foreign language. Admitting exhaustion feels like breaking an ancient rule. Letting someone see their sadness feels like stepping into unfamiliar light. But every act of honesty plants a seed. Psychologically, this stage is marked by the slow rewiring of internal beliefs. The mind begins to question the scripts it once treated as truth. Scripts like, you must handle everything alone, your emotions inconvenience others, you do not deserve care. These beliefs, once rigid, start to soften. Not because they suddenly vanish, but because life offers new evidence that contradicts the old lessons. Someone listens without irritation. Someone stays when the mask slips. Someone offers comfort without being asked. And slowly, the psyche begins to understand that support is not a debt and vulnerability is not a crime. Reconstruction also involves the body. For years, the body has held tension, tight shoulders, shallow breaths, a stomach that knots at the thought of needing others. As healing begins, these sensations start to shift. Breathing becomes deeper, posture loosens. The nervous system, once tuned to detect threat, begins to learn safety. This is not a linear process. Some days, they take 2 steps forward. Other days, the old fear returns. Don't bother anyone. Stay small. Stay quiet. But even on those days, something has changed. They notice the fear instead of obeying it blindly. Awareness becomes the foundation of healing. They begin to say small truths out loud. I'm tired today. That hurt me. I could use some help. These sentences feel heavy at first, almost forbidden. Their voice may shake. Their chest may tighten. Each time they speak, they reclaim a piece of themselves they once gave away. Reconstruction also means learning reciprocity, not only giving care, but receiving it. For people who fear burdening others, receiving kindness can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling. But slowly, they discover that accepting care does not strain relationships, it deepens them. A friend who listens does not break. A partner who supports does not drift away. A loved one who shows concern does not regret it. These moments teach them that connection is not built on silence, it is built on presence. Healing also reveals a profound truth: they have always been worthy of the space they denied themselves, not because they earned it. Not because they became easy to love, but because worthiness was never the issue, the fear simply kept it hidden. Reconstruction, then, is not about becoming someone new. It is about returning to the self that existed before fear taught them to shrink. The self that could speak openly. The self that believed in softness. The self that trusted others without calculating the cost. With time, they begin to live differently. They reach out before collapsing. They share their emotions before they overflow. They rest without guilt. They let others see the unpolished parts of them, the human parts, the ones that were once wrapped in silence. Healing does not turn them loud. It does not make them demanding. It simply allows them to exist without negotiation. Reconstruction is quiet, but powerful. It shapes a life where their presence is no longer something to manage or minimize. It transforms fear into understanding, and understanding into compassion, not just for others, but finally for themselves. And slowly, they learn the truth that eluded them for years. They were never a burden. They were simply a person learning how to be human in a world that once taught them to hide. In the end, the journey of those who fear being a burden leads to a truth that is both gentle and startling. The weight they carried was never truly theirs. For years, they believed their presence was something to manage, their emotions something to hide, their needs something to suppress. They walked through life as if every step must be measured, every word softened, every desire trimmed into silence. And yet, the world never asked them to do this. Their fear asked. Their past asked. The echoes of old wounds asked, but not the world. Not the people who genuinely care. As healing deepens, a new understanding begins to take shape, first like a whisper, then like a quiet certainty. The burden was not you. The burden was the belief that you had to carry everything alone. This final chapter is not about transformation in the dramatic sense. It is about recognition, the moment when a person sees the truth with clarity, without distortion, without the shadows of childhood shaping the lens. Recognition that their needs were never excessive. Recognition that their voice was never too loud. Recognition that their presence was never too heavy. This realization does not erase the years of silence. It does not rewrite the past, but it softens it. It places a warm hand on the shoulder of who they were and tells them, gently, you carried too much. And you carried it alone. But you don't have to anymore. In this stage, the mind becomes quieter, not from avoidance, but from peace. The nervous system begins to trust what once felt impossible, that they can lean without falling, that they can ask without harming, that they can take up space without tipping the world off balance. They start to notice the small things that once passed by unseen, the way someone listens without looking away, the way a friend stays even when they reveal their sadness, the way a partner doesn't flinch when they speak their truth, the way love does not collapse even when they let themselves be held. These moments are not dramatic. They are steady, they are calm. They are proof that connection does not demand perfection, only presence. And so, their relationship with themselves begins to shift. Where they once apologized automatically, they now pause and breathe. Where they once translated silence into rejection, they now consider other possibilities. Where they once felt guilt for needing comfort, they now recognize that needing is simply part of being human. The fear doesn't vanish entirely. It lingers like a familiar shadow. But shadows lose their power when you learn to walk in the light. The person who once shrank to keep peace now learns to expand, slowly, gently, with caution but also with courage. They begin to speak not just to be understood, but to exist fully. They begin to feel without hiding. They begin to rest without justification. And gradually, the world around them feels different, not because the world changed, but because they did. This final chapter is a return to the self that existed before fear taught them to disappear, a return to a heart that was always capable of connection, a return to a truth so simple it almost feels revolutionary. You were never a burden. You were simply someone longing to be seen without fear. In the quiet of this realization, a new life begins, not louder, not brighter, just more honest, more open, more whole. They walk through the world now with a gentler step, not because they are shrinking, but because they are finally walking at their true pace, a pace that does not rush to meet others' expectations, a pace that does not hide behind emotional discipline, a pace that honors their humanity as much as anyone else's, and as they move forward, they leave behind the belief that once held them captive, not with anger, not with grief, but with gratitude for the strength it took to survive and the courage it takes to begin again. In this final reflection, one truth remains: you are not a weight. You never were. Your presence is not something others carry. It is something others receive. And in this gentle knowing, the story finds its closing breath, a soft reminder that taking up space in the world is not a burden, but a birthright,